Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. The morning of the fourth day was still, the kind of heavy silence you get before a thunderstorm or a funeral procession. Salt hung in the air, sharp and damp, clinging to every board of the dock like sweat on skin. I'd been a commercial fisherman for 20 years. My boat, the Mirabelle, was a 31-foot Parker with a twin Yamaha outboards, docked now at Gulls Reach Marina, near the tip of Cape Lookout, North Carolina. I'd weathered hurricanes and engine fires, broken ribs and broken marriages, but nothing like this. My name's Cole Maddox, 44, widower. I'd pulled my daughter Riley out of her Wilmington high school the morning of day one when the emergency alerts began lighting up phones. First, it was a CDC bulletin, then the governor's executive order. We watched the I-40 crawl with evacuees and sirens as we pushed east toward the coast, slipping through the back roads I knew from shrimping seasons. The military had promised a rescue ship, something big. Maybe a converted NOAA vessel or a Navy support ship from Norfolk. Word was it would dock just past the Channel Inlet on day 3, pick up non-infected civilians, and head to safer waters. We weren't alone. When we got here, there were maybe 20 others, families, boaters, retirees, everyone with a carload of food, fuel, and fear. Some slept in their RVs parked in the marina lot. Others, like us, had boats. There were generators humming, radios crackling with static, people bartering propane tanks for clean water. But that was 3 days ago. Now we were down to maybe 15. Some had gotten spooked by the silence and tried to motor south towards Charleston or north to Hatteras. One boat returned the second night, hull cracked, engine ruined, nobody on board. After that, nobody left. The worst part was the radio. The same NOAA emergency broadcast, cycling every 10 minutes on Channel 16. This is a United States emergency maritime broadcast. All civilians on the North Carolina coast seeking evacuation should proceed to designated pickup points. Maritime Transport Command Vessel Delacroix will arrive within 72 hours. Remain in place. Avoid mainland contact. This message will repeat. Only now. There was static creeping in, warping the voice like a garbled prayer. Nobody knew if the ship had sunk or if it ever existed. Riley sat next to me on the stern, legs swinging off the transom. Her blonde hair was tied back in a frayed bandana, and she was wearing my old oilskin jacket despite the heat. "Dad, that smells worse today." She wasn't wrong. The tide had pulled in a mess of debris. Pieces of fiberglass hulls, a torn lifebuoy from a ferry called Ocracoke Queen, and something worse. Bodies. 4 of them. They'd drifted up in the early morning fog, pale and bloated, with wounds that didn't come from drowning. The worst was a girl, maybe 8 years old, face half gone, wearing a life vest from a local eco-tour company. We didn't touch them. None of us did. Brian McKee, a retired Coast Guard petty officer and the closest thing we had to leadership here, tried to keep people calm. He'd been sleeping on his old Boston whaler, armed with a Mossberg 590 pump action and a case of MREs. "I say we give it till sundown," he told me that morning. "If Delacroix doesn't show, we make a call. Either head out in convoy or bunker here." "I've got fuel for about 100 nautical miles," I said. "I can reach Bald Head or maybe Morehead City if I push it." Brian shook his head. "I wouldn't count on Morehead. Last night I picked up a ham transmission from a private rig on the mainland. Said the port's overrun." Overrun. That word had become a stand-in for everything we feared but didn't want to say out loud. Overrun didn't mean looters or panicked mobs anymore. It meant them, the infected, the sick ones, the fast ones, the ones that didn't stay dead. At noon, we had our first breach. A man named Arturo Delgado, a seasonal dockhand from Beaufort, had gone down to the end of the pier to check the crab traps. He was good with boats, strong as hell, always the first to volunteer to fix something. I watched from the flybridge as he bent over one of the traps, yanked the line hard, and something else came up with it. At first, I thought it was kelp or a net snag. Then it moved. It grabbed him, right from the water, fast, like it had been waiting. Arturo shouted once. Then he fell backward, screaming and kicking. The trap forgotten. His foot caught the cleat. He went down with a splash. For a few seconds, we saw the thrashing. Then the water turned dark. Brian fired 2 shots into the surf, more out of panic than aim. We found nothing but blood and half a boot. That changed everything. The infected were here, in the water, and they weren't drifting, they were swimming. The group convened that afternoon under the marina's old bait shack. It had a rusted tin roof, a busted fridge, and a fading pinup calendar from 2016. We counted 12 people left. Brian, me, and Riley, an older couple, Don and Louise, who lived full-time on their 28-foot Catalina sailboat. A mother and son, Dana and Owen, both quiet and frightened. The Jenkins family, who'd run a charter diving company until last week. And Reggie, a high school science teacher with a shortwave radio and the only working water filter. Reggie cleared his throat. I picked up a signal, just one, faint, not the Delacroix. This was a loop from a FEMA relay tower in Norfolk. Says the coast is no longer secure. No further evacuations planned. Silence fell like a dropped anchor. Louise burst into tears. Dana held her son close. Brian stood, his hand resting on the butt of his shotgun. "Okay," he said, voice level. We split into 2 groups. Those with boats capable of going offshore form a flotilla. We head east, maybe hook south to open water. Maybe the Coast Guard's still operating from the Gulf. Everyone else bunkers here until help arrives or conditions improve. "What if there's no help?" Riley asked quietly. No one answered her. That night, I couldn't sleep. Riley curled up in the cabin berth below, clutching one of the dog-eared paperbacks she'd grabbed from Home Hatchet, I think. I sat in the wheelhouse, listening to the motor hum and the distant slap of waves against hulls. I scanned the horizon with binoculars. Empty sea. But the surf was rising, and the tide. Something was wrong with the tide. It wasn't natural, the way the water pushed in, not like the usual lunar pull. It surged like something was displacing it farther out, like something big was coming in. Then I saw it, movement. Not boats, not birds. Figures. 3. No. 4 silhouettes crawling out of the surf like wet insects. Shambling, staggering, their limbs moving wrong. One of them was missing an arm. Another had its jaw hanging like a broken hinge. They didn't speak, they didn't scream. They just kept coming. I woke Riley, grabbed the flare gun, slammed on the horn, one long burst. Brian was up in seconds. Don shouted from his sailboat. Louise was already climbing onto the dock, her scream echoing across the water. The infected were on the pier now, slipping on the algae-covered planks, but undeterred. One caught Dana by the leg as she ran, and it took 3 people to pull her free. Reggie swung a boat hook like a baseball bat, knocking one into the water, but it didn't drown. It vanished beneath the surface, Then seconds later it emerged, clawing at a piling like it meant to climb it. I'd never seen anything like it. The cold truth settled into my gut. These things could move in water, and they weren't slow. Brian reloaded his shotgun, pumping 2 more shells into the infected as they stumbled between the boats. One slumped to the side. Its skull caved in, but the other kept crawling with half a chest, its legs dragging behind like broken oars. I grabbed Riley's arm and pulled her hard toward the Mirabelle, nearly dragging her across the slick planks. I didn't stop to help Don and Louise, though they were just ahead of us. Every second was another risk of being pulled into that churning, corpse-laden surf. The generator-powered floodlights flickered over the dock and gave the whole scene a terrible, jerky rhythm, like watching an old movie reel stutter. Screams echoed between the masts. I saw Dana hobble toward her boat, blood trailing from a deep gash on her calf, while Owen pushed her ahead with everything he had. Reggie was still on the main dock, trying to lift a young girl, the Jenkins daughter, who tripped and rolled her ankle. 2 infected had broken through the line and were closing in on them fast. I shouted, but my voice was drowned by a second gunshot, followed by a long, agonizing scream. Riley looked back, her face pale in the light. "We have to help them." I shoved her toward the Mirabelle's ladder. "Climb now." She did, clambering up onto the deck just as I cut the mooring lines. The boat drifted slightly as I jumped on behind her, slipping the starboard rope free just before the bow spun away from the pier. I jammed the key into the ignition and turned over both engines. The Yamahas roared to life. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Reggie lift the girl over the railing of a Sea Ray cabin cruiser. He turned to run, but the infected caught him from behind, dragging him down. His screams were short and gurgled as blood sprayed across the dock boards. The last thing I saw before pushing the throttle was the Sea Ray sputtering away, just barely ahead of the horror now feasting behind it. We pulled out of the marina into the dark water of the channel, our floodlights off. I didn't want to draw more attention, not if they could see or hear us. The Mirabelle bobbed in the current as I adjusted our heading southeast, following the markers out past the inlet. Riley knelt on the deck, clutching the flare gun like it was a crucifix. Her eyes were fixed on the dock behind us, now shrinking into the dark, echoing with distant screams and splashes. There were no more flares, no more lights, just the surf and the hum of the motors. We made it 2 nautical miles offshore before I slowed the engines and let us drift. The sea was calm, unusually calm, like the storm had passed but left something poisonous in its wake. Riley stayed below deck, curled into a corner of the cabin berth. I stepped out onto the stern deck and stared at the faint glow of the coast behind us. Other vessels had made it out too. I counted 3, maybe 4. Don and Louise's sailboat bobbed just off our starboard side. The Sea Ray was farther out, running on one engine, smoke trailing from the exhaust stack. Another smaller skiff floated in silence. I didn't recognize it. Brian's boat was missing. So were the rest. I flipped on the broadband marine radio and dialed through the emergency channels. Static. Just static. Noah was silent now, the last repeating message finally gone. I tried hailing the other vessels on VHF channel 68. "This is the Mirabelle. Any vessels reading me, respond. Anyone out there, respond." A crackle, then a weak voice. "Don. Mirabelle, this is the Solana. We're afloat, no injuries. Copy that, Don. Any contact with others?" Silence then. "No, just you and that Sea Ray far as I can tell." I tried again on channel 16. Nothing. The truth sank in. The dock was gone. The Delacroix, if it had ever existed, wasn't coming. We were on our own, floating in open water with a handful of strangers and dwindling fuel. Morning came thick with mist and the faint metallic taste of sea air. Riley sat next to me on the bow, her arms wrapped around her knees. Neither of us had really slept. The water around us was glassy and lifeless. No gulls, no dolphins, no shrimp boats trawling the shelf. Just that gnawing silence again. "We can't just drift forever," she said finally, voice hoarse. "We won't," I replied. "We follow the coast south. If we can reach a fuel depot or a working marina, we restock. If not, we keep going. Florida, maybe the Keys. Someone out there has to have a plan." She nodded, but didn't speak again. Aboard the Solana Dawn raised a flag, an old distress signal, bright orange with a black square and dot. It fluttered weakly in the breeze. I knew what it meant. We're afloat, we need assistance, but we're not sinking. I raised one in return. By noon, the Sea Ray caught up to us. Dana and Owen were aboard, but the girl Reggie had saved was nowhere to be seen. Dana's leg was bandaged hastily with duct tape and strips of shirt. Owen looked barely able to keep the boat on course. They pulled alongside and I helped tie off the cleats. "She bled out," Donna said flatly. "The girl. She was too far gone." "We saw Reggie," I started, but she shook her head. "Don't. Please." We gave them water, some protein bars, and Riley offered her one of our spare med kits. Dana took it without a word. It was then I noticed something bobbing in the water behind us, a large shape, gray. No, it was red, faded to gray, a lifeboat, inflatable, Navy style, just floating there, its pontoon sides torn in two places. We moved closer to it. Don came about on the Solana, his sails flapping as he circled the raft. I grabbed a hook and reached out. Inside the lifeboat were two bodies, dressed in military gear. One had a sidearm still holstered, standard issue Sig Sauer P-200-26, salt scarred but intact. The other clutched a flare canister. Neither looked infected, just dead, probably from blood loss. One had a tourniquet high on his thigh, the fabric soaked through. I climbed aboard carefully and retrieved what I could. The sidearm, the extra magazines, a waterproof satchel of field rations, and a laminated clipboard with faded lettering. It read, USNS Delacroix Evacuation Manifest, Segment A2. Date, March 4th, orders. Load Civilian Manifest Groups 1, 3 from Point Lookout. Return to CB Norfolk for decontamination and reroute. There was more, but the ink was ruined. The only thing that stuck out was the manifest section. They had sent the ship, but if these soldiers were here, drifting in an abandoned raft, it meant something had gone wrong. Badly wrong. I tossed the raft a few extra gallons of gas for Don to tow, then returned to the helm. Riley stared at the P-226 in my hand and said nothing. At night, we drifted again. Quiet. No radio. No lights. But just after midnight, I heard the sound again. Something in the water. At first, it was a bump, light and hollow, like driftwood tapping the hull. I went out to the deck with a flashlight, but the beam only reached 12 feet. I switched it off, afraid to draw attention. But then came another bump. And another, from the stern this time. Then I saw them. Shapes. Not logs, not debris. Hands. Pale arms slapping at the hull, clawing at the railing. One face surfaced beside the outboard. A bloated man with milky eyes and bloodless lips gnashing silently. They had followed us. Somehow. The infected could track us. Maybe not through smell or sound like the old stories said, but they could sense movement. Maybe it was the vibration of the engines, the heat of human bodies, or something worse. Either way, they were here. I could feel the hull vibrate as we tore across the open water. the bow lifting slightly with each wave crest. The infected in the water faded quickly behind us, but I kept checking the wake, searching for more shapes breaking the surface. The sheer number of them back at the marina, and the fact that they were swimming, or at least floating with purpose, changed everything. We weren't just fleeing the mainland now, we were fleeing the tide itself. The Mirabelle surged ahead of the others. We had the strongest engines and the cleanest hull, which meant we now bore the burden of leading. I throttled down once we passed the 6-mile marker, letting the others catch up. The wind had picked up from the west, and the sea was getting choppier. Riley clung to the grab rail beside me, her face pale, still gripping the blood-smeared boat hook. I gently pried it from her hand and leaned it against the helm station. She didn't speak. The Solana came into view first, its mainsail full but unsteady. Dawn was at the tiller, and Louise waved from the cockpit. They had fared better than the rest. Quiet propulsion, no prop wash to attract attention. Dana's Sea Ray lagged behind, listing slightly to starboard. It was obvious the hull had taken damage, likely from debris or a submerged piling during their escape. I opened comms on channel 68. "This is Mirabelle to Sea Ray. You holding together?" A moment passed before Owen's voice came through, shaky but clear. "We're taking on some water. Not critical yet, but the bilge pump's working overtime. I think we cracked the starboard hull plate near the stern. You need to patch in open water. Negative for now. We're still mobile." I switched over to Dawn's frequency. We need to put serious distance between us and that inlet. 10, 15 nautical miles minimum. "Agreed," Dawn replied. "They're in the water, Cole. Christ, they swam after us." "Yeah, they're not just drifting. They're trailing noise, maybe heat, anything moving." "Where are we headed?" I looked at the paper chart taped beside the helm. South, hugging the outer banks. The Gulf Stream was too far, but maybe we could swing east, cross the continental shelf, and find one of the deepwater platforms still manned, if any still were. "I'm thinking Frying Pan Tower," I said. "It's about 30 miles southeast of here. Old Coast Guard light station, now privately owned. It's been used for dive charters and offshore weather monitoring. Might be abandoned, might not. Think we can dock? There's a platform. Hoist system, too. If it's not wrecked, we can tie off." There was a pause. "You think it's safer out there?" No one's been broadcasting from shore in over 24 hours. And if the infected can follow sound or engines, we need a place to anchor that doesn't float. We cruised southeast for most of the afternoon. Riley eventually came back to the helm, still quiet but alert. She sat beside me, arms wrapped around her knees. "What happens if there's no one left at Frying Pan?" she asked, her voice barely above the hum of the motors. "Then we make it a home, or we push farther out." I didn't tell her what I'd really been thinking, that maybe there was no safe place left along the coast, that every harbor was just another trap, every marina another feeding ground. By late afternoon, we spotted the tower. Frying Pan Shoals. Light Tower stood like a skeleton on stilts above the open Atlantic, so 30 miles offshore, just south of Cape Fear. It was a rust-streaked relic of Cold War engineering. An octagonal platform built on steel pylons, once a manned lighthouse and later repurposed as a research outpost. I had visited once years ago during a tuna run. Back then, there'd been solar panels, a helipad, and even a generator shack bolted to the upper deck. Through binoculars, I could see the structure still standing. The beacon lens was dark, but the tower itself looked intact. No smoke, no movement. I circled wide, doing a slow loop around the base. "Looks abandoned," I said. "No obvious damage." Don's voice came through the radio. If it's clear, we can make a temporary mooring. I'm going up to check. Riley, stay on the helm. If anything moves up there, if I so much as hesitate, you back this boat off fast. Understand?" She nodded and didn't argue. That alone told me how serious things had become. I clipped my safety harness to the boarding ladder, strapped the Sig Sauer to my belt, and climbed on to the lowest platform rung. The steel was cold and damp, the salt air biting into the weld seams. I hauled myself up, past rusted pipes and long dry drainage lines, until I reached the main platform. The wind howled louder up there, and I could see the endless Atlantic in every direction. The emptiness was oppressive. I drew the pistol and moved forward. The doors to the central module were open, swinging slightly in the breeze. Inside was dark, but not destroyed. The main room was cluttered with old equipment: solar regulators, a dehumidifier, a mini fridge turned on its side, but no bodies, no blood. Just dust and the smell of mildew. I stepped cautiously through the station, checking the crew quarters, the observation deck, and finally the generator room. Everything was intact. Power systems were shut down, but not vandalized. Whoever had been here, they had left in a hurry, but not in panic. I keyed the radio. Clear, towers unoccupied, no signs of infestation. That night, the 3 boats moored to the tower using long, cleated lines run from the main legs. We rigged a makeshift pulley system to help transfer supplies up and down. Dawn and Louise stayed on the Solana, but Dana and Owen climbed up with us to sleep inside the weather shelter. I reactivated the old wind turbine and spliced it into the tower's remaining battery bank. After some finagling, we got power to a few interior lights and 1 working VHF unit. It felt like a miracle. We set watch rotations. I took the first shift, seated on the observation deck with the Sig in my lap, listening to the wind slice over the Atlantic. I could see the boats bobbing gently below. Riley slept just inside the hatchway, curled beneath a wool blanket and using a duffel bag as a pillow. She looked smaller than usual, thinner too. None of us had eaten well in days. At 0300 hours, I saw the first flare. South-southwest, maybe 20 miles out, it arced low, red, not white. An emergency distress signal, 1 flare, then nothing. Don came up beside me, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "You see that?" "Yeah." We waited. No second flare. No response on radio, nothing but the cold, empty sea in the dark. They're either out of flares or already dead. He didn't argue. The following morning, I got the marine broadband back online using parts scavenged from the satellite dish. It was weak, but functional. I caught snippets of emergency bands, fragmented messages, automated alerts from as far north as New Jersey. One phrase kept repeating: Maritime Safety Zone Bravo. Coastal access restricted. All civilian vessels advised to remain offshore until confirmation of control measures. But no one defined control. No one told us what the situation really was. Every message was either pre-recorded or fragmentary. It was like the voice of civilization itself was choking on static. Dana approached me around noon, holding a water jug and visibly limping. She gestured to her bandaged calf. Bite didn't break skin, scrape mostly, but I'd like a second opinion. I checked it myself, deep abrasion, some torn muscle, but not a classic bite. No teeth punctures, no arterial damage. Still, I disinfected it thoroughly and wrapped it again. "I'll keep an eye on it," I said. "You think they're coming out this far?" she asked quietly. They made it 6 miles from shore. With the current pulling south, they could reach this tower. If they're tracking by sound, we've got to stay quiet. Riley stood nearby, listening. Her eyes met mine. That afternoon, we found a drone. It was a commercial model, DJI Mavic 3 painted black and salt-encrusted, stuck to the platform's upper railing. Its battery was dead, but the SD card was intact. Owen and I brought it inside, and I used my laptop and a solar-charged inverter to boot the footage. It showed aerial shots of the coast, beaches littered with wrecks, rows of bodies laid out along highways, groups of infected shambling through abandoned towns. Then a ship, massive, gray, smoking. The Delacroix. The footage captured it at a distance, surrounded by lifeboats. Then came flashes. Fire on the deck, panic, people jumping overboard. The final frame showed the ship listing, half consumed in flame, somewhere off Wrightsville Beach. The rescue had come, and failed. We sat in silence, watching the looping footage again and again, as if willing a different ending. There was none. That night, we stood on the deck of the tower, watching the stars emerge in cloudless skies. The sea looked peaceful, but none of us trusted it anymore. It wasn't just the fear of infected floating beneath us. It was the knowledge that every second we spent adrift, the world behind us decayed further into something unrecognizable. The stars were the same, but everything else was shifting beneath our feet. I took the second watch while Riley tried to sleep inside the upper quarters. She was exhausted, but even in her sleep she twitched and mumbled, as if reliving every moment of the last 4 days on repeat. Dawn sat beside me near the tower's south railing, keeping one eye on the mooring lines and the other on the sea. The Solana was still tied below, gently bobbing against one leg of the platform, sails furled and navigation lights off. For hours, we sat in silence, only the sound of the wind tugging at the corroded metal, until Dawn finally spoke. Back in 2004, I sailed solo to Bermuda. 30-foot sloop, hit a squall off Hatteras. Thought I was going to die. He paused, rubbing his hands together, staring out at the inky black water. I was scared then, yeah, but it wasn't like this. That was nature. This is something else. I didn't answer. What could I say? The storm that had consumed the world wasn't made of wind or waves. It was made of people. People twisted into things that had no right still moving. It was made of silence on emergency channels and drifting lifeboats filled with corpses. Made of that single, damning flare over the horizon with no follow-up and no survivors. Sometime, after 0400, I spotted movement on the surface. Low, irregular wakes, like something just under the waterline. My gut clenched as I raised the binoculars. The starlight was weak, but it was enough. 3 dark shapes drifted slowly just outside the tower's shadow. I tracked them for several minutes. No lights, no radio contact, no engine sounds. Then I saw an arm reach from the water and hook around a floating barrel, not flailing, just grasping. They were here again. I didn't wake Riley, not yet. I quietly roused Dana and Owen and signaled Don and Louise with a flashlight. Within 20 minutes, we had all gathered in the central control room. The lights were kept low and the windows shuttered. I explained what I saw, and we reviewed our options. None of them were good. Don was the first to suggest abandoning the tower entirely and heading farther out to sea, maybe toward the Gulf. Louise argued that fuel was too low, and the chance of running into another storm or more infected at sea was too great. Owen just looked at his mother, waiting for her to decide. Dana's response surprised me. I say we stay here. This place is elevated. We've got visibility, partial power, and time. They might be in the water, but they haven't breached the tower yet. I agreed, for now. We set up a rotating watch at each corner of the platform. Floodlights were disabled to reduce our signature. I pulled the solar battery fuse. Our systems were only good for basic comms and shortwave charging now. Riley took the dawn watch with Owen. I insisted she carry the SIG, even though she still flinched at the idea of pulling the trigger. The sea remained eerily calm through sunrise. I scanned the horizon every 10 minutes. The infected didn't surface again, not visibly, but none of us relaxed. At noon, something changed. A low thump vibrated through the tower legs. It was subtle, barely noticeable at first, but repeated every few minutes. It didn't sound like waves. It was too steady. Dana felt it too. What is that? We traced the vibration to the southern support column. Looking down over the edge, we spotted a shape clinging to the base of the pylon, barely visible above the waterline. Arms, legs. A bloated head tilted upward. It wasn't moving fast, just anchored there like a barnacle, clinging stubbornly. Then we spotted more. 5, no, 6, all clustered at the base of the tower. Some floating, some actively clinging to the steel support beams. They weren't attempting to climb yet, but they were waiting. They had followed us, just like before, but this time they weren't testing the perimeter. They were anchoring themselves. Silent, watching, listening. Owen vomited off the side of the platform. "This isn't a patrol, this is a siege," I said aloud, more to myself than anyone else. Riley stepped forward. "What do we do if they try to come up?" I didn't have a good answer. The tower had no true fortifications, just steel ladders and grated walkways. If even one of them made it onto the lower platform, they'd have full access to the structure. Don suggested welding the hatchways shut. Dana argued that would trap us inside if anything went wrong. In the end, we settled on barricading the primary access ladder with marine chain and a weighted anchor. It wouldn't hold forever, but it would buy time. That night, we heard them groaning. Not loud, not like the stories, just a faint, breathless wailing, barely audible over the wind. Not meant to alert, meant to wear us down. Day 5 began under low cloud cover and wind gusts from the north. The water turned choppy, and the tower groaned with each wave slap. We stayed inside the control room most of the morning, running inventory. Don and Louise had 7 days of food aboard the Solana. Dana's boat had 5. We had 9, maybe 10 if we rationed tightly. We had enough water for 5 days, thanks mostly to the tower's old desalination tank, which still held a few usable gallons. We passed the time checking the radio and scanning weather forecasts. Still no new transmissions. Still no military signals. NOAA channels continued to repeat their last looped message, the same pre-recorded warning about safe zones that no longer existed. At 15 o'clock, Riley saw one of the infected climbing. It started with a splash, small, like something had slipped. But then she spotted a figure 3 rungs up the east ladder. We all rushed out. Sure enough, a pale, waterlogged man, barefoot, limbs quivering from cold or rot, was hauling himself up the support structure with slow, painful progress. His right foot dangled unnaturally, half severed, flopping with each step. I didn't hesitate. I drew the SIG and fired 3 shots from above. 2 missed. 1 caught the base of the skull, and the body crumpled back into the sea. Another head surfaced moments later. Then another. Soon there were 8, maybe more, all circling the base of the tower, some groping blindly along the lower ladders. They were escalating. We initiated evacuation protocol. It was clear we wouldn't survive another night here. The plan was crude but simple. 1 at a time, we'd rappel down to the Mirabelle and Solana with the Sea Ray rigged as a decoy to draw attention away from the departure. We'd dump debris overboard, run the bilge pump full on, and let her drift southeast on a slow burn. The infected, if drawn by noise, would follow. Dana and Owen went first, lowered in silence to the Mirabelle, which I had repositioned near the south edge of the platform, then Louise, then Riley. Dawn and I stayed back to cut the moorings and set the decoy plan in motion. The Sea Ray's remaining gas was pumped into an auxiliary tank, and I jury-rigged a timed spark from the bilge wire. We filled the cockpit with torn seat foam and a dash of kerosene from the tower's abandoned generator stash. When the boat lit up, it did so in eerie silence. The flames climbed fast, licking at the fiberglass and sailcloth. I saw movement in the water immediately. 3 shapes breaking off from the base of the tower, paddling toward the burning hulk with unsettling coordination. It worked. Dawn dropped the last line and climbed into the Solana I followed to the Mirabelle. We powered up and pulled away, slow at first, throttling up only when we passed the 10-mile mark. No movement behind us, no pursuit, no flares, just open water. We didn't stop until dusk. That night, we anchored near a dead freighter drifting 30 miles offshore. No name, no markings, just a rusted hulk full of scavenged containers and salt-eaten steel. We tied the boats together for safety and slept in shifts. Riley curled beside me in the helm chair, her face tucked into my coat. She finally slept without twitching. Dana and Owen ate quietly from the rations. Dawn and Louise sipped coffee on the bow of the Solana. None of us spoke about where we were headed anymore. We didn't know. South, maybe. Toward the warm water. Toward somewhere the maps no longer covered. Somewhere the tide hadn't reached. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.